Get out of that seat, now. You're making the other passengers uncomfortable." The words, sharp and cold, sliced through the quiet hum of the cabin on American Airlines Flight 1282 from Charlotte to Paris. They echoed off the polished surfaces of the first-class cabin, each syllable dripping with an authority that expected no argument. The voice belonged to Catherine Miller, the lead flight attendant. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture ramrod straight, and her expression was a mask of professional condescension. Her gaze was fixed, like a laser, on a single passenger, an 11-year-old black boy sitting serenely in seat 2A. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't being loud or disruptive. He wasn't fumbling with his luggage or looking lost. He was simply sitting with a quiet confidence, his back straight, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He wore a crisp white button-down shirt under a soft cashmere sweater, tailored slacks, and a pair of immaculate brand-new Air Jordans on his feet. His gaze was directed out the window, watching the ground crew scurry across the tarmac below. But to Catherine, his very presence in that seat was an offense. Before we delve into this powerful story of dignity and quiet strength, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Your support helps us bring these important narratives to light. Now, back to the story. The boy's name was Marcus Jordan. He was 11 years old, and though he carried a name that resonated with greatness, he wore it with an unassuming humility. His backpack, a sleek, monogrammed leather accessory, was stowed neatly under the seat in front of him. Marcus had flown more times than he could count, crisscrossing the globe with his family, but this was his first international flight alone. In his pocket was a first-class ticket, a ticket purchased for him by his father, a man the world knew simply as Michael Jordan. But Marcus never mentioned his father's name. He didn't believe in using it as a shield or a sword. He believed in standing on his own 2 feet. He turned his head slowly from the window, his eyes, which held a wisdom beyond his years, meeting Catherine's icy stare. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This seat is mine," he stated, his voice calm and even. "I'm not asking. I'm stating a fact." Catherine blinked, momentarily taken aback by the boy's unwavering composure. A flicker of surprise crossed her face before being replaced by a saccharine, condescending smile. "Sweetie," she cooed, her voice laced with a false syrupy concern that didn't reach her eyes. "This is first class. You must have gotten turned around. It's an easy mistake to make." She stood there, blocking the aisle, an immovable object of misplaced authority, her posture screaming, "I am in charge here, and you, little boy, are clearly out of your depth." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't shrink under her patronizing gaze. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his sweater, retrieved his boarding pass, and held it up for her to see. His hand was steady, his movements deliberate. "American Airlines, Flight 1282, he read, his voice clear and articulate. "Seat 2A. Would you like to scan it again?" Catherine didn't take the ticket. She didn't even glance at it. Instead, she crossed her arms, her lips tightening into a thin, disapproving line. "Our policy," she declared, her voice regaining its sharp edge, "requires that all unaccompanied minors be seated in a designated row, for their own safety and the convenience of the crew. We'll find you a more suitable seat in the main cabin. Just follow me." Marcus's voice remained steady, a calm counterpoint to her rising irritation. "That's not what the check-in staff explained to my father." He called ahead and confirmed everything with the airline's executive liaison. "I am cleared to sit here." Catherine's mask of professional courtesy slipped, revealing the impatience simmering beneath. "Sir," she snapped, her use of the formal address a deliberate mockery. "I am not going to stand here and argue with a child. Please, gather your belongings." A few nearby passengers began to stir, their quiet conversations tapering off as they turned to watch the unfolding drama. A woman in seat 2C, a middle-aged French businesswoman named Isabelle Dubois, leaned over and whispered, her voice laced with concern, "Why are you making him move? He is not causing any trouble." Catherine shot her a withering glare before pointedly ignoring her. She tapped her earpiece, her voice crisp and authoritative. "We need a gate agent to first class. I have a passenger in the wrong seat. A child. Seems to be some confusion with his ticket." Minutes later, a young gate agent hurried up the jet bridge. Her name tag read, Tamika Jones, and she looked to be in her mid-20s. She paused at the entrance to the first-class cabin, her eyes taking in the scene. When she saw Marcus, a flicker of recognition crossed her face, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly before her professional mask slipped back into place. "Let me see the boarding pass, ma'am," she said, her voice calm and respectful. Marcus handed it to her without a word. Tamika scanned it with her handheld device. A green light flashed. "Confirmed," she said, nodding. "Seat 2A, American Airlines Executive Platinum. He's in the correct seat." Catherine's lips thinned into an even tighter line. "Be that as it may, our policy on unaccompanied minors." Tamika cut her off, her voice gentle but firm. "His file has a special notation from the executive office. It's been pre-approved by corporate. There's an override on the standard policy." "Mrs. Dubois spoke up again, her voice louder this time, cutting through the tense silence. "So, if the ticket is correct and there is special clearance, why was he being threatened with removal?" Silence. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. Just then, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a pilot's uniform emerged from the cockpit. Jason Reynolds, the first officer, surveyed the scene with an air of weary impatience. "What's the holdup here?" he asked, his gaze flicking from Marcus to Catherine. She gave him a brief, biased summary of the situation, framing it as a simple seating mix-up, a misunderstanding of policy. Jason looked down at Marcus, then at Tamika's scanner, then back at Catherine. A cold, dismissive look crossed his face. "Let's just move him to economy," he said, his voice flat and final. "We don't need any disruptions before a transatlantic flight." Tamika looked stunned. "Sir, his ticket is confirmed. He's cleared by corporate." Jason waved a dismissive hand. "We'll sort it out with management later. For now, just get him out of the seat. We're on a schedule." Marcus didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He simply stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He picked up his monogrammed backpack, his small shoulders squared. He took one last look at the comfortable leather seat he had occupied for only a few minutes, then turned to face Catherine. He looked her directly in the eye, and in a voice that was barely a whisper but carried the weight of a much older soul, he said, "I hope you understand what you've just done." And with that, he turned and walked out of the first-class cabin, his head held high. He was escorted not by a compassionate flight attendant, but by a policy twisted and weaponized by prejudice. They found him a seat in the very last row of the plane, a cramped middle seat next to the noisy galley, a place usually reserved for last-minute standbys. He didn't complain. He simply sat down, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the illuminated seatbelt sign above him. A man across the aisle stared at him, his expression a mixture of pity and curiosity. A young couple in the row ahead whispered to each other, casting furtive glances in his direction. But Marcus didn't look at them. He pulled out his phone, a simple, unadorned device, and pressed a single contact. The phone rang once, then twice. Then, in a voice that was steady and clear, he spoke. "Dad," he said, "it's happening again." The low hum of the aircraft engines was a constant, monotonous drone, a stark contrast to the turbulent emotions swirling within the cabin of Flight 1282. Marcus sat in his new seat, a world away from the plush comfort of 2A, a world away from the quiet dignity his father had so carefully arranged for him. The air in the rear of the plane felt thick, heavy with the unspoken judgment of strangers. It felt as though the very oxygen had been thinned, each breath a little harder to draw. But the boy didn't slump in his seat. He didn't fidget or complain. He sat tall, his back straight, his hands folded neatly in his lap, a portrait of quiet resilience. In the first-class cabin, Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their hushed conversations filled with a mixture of confusion and indignation. They had witnessed something unsettling, something that felt less like a procedural correction and more like a deliberate act of humiliation. Tamika Jones, the young gate agent who had tried to intervene, stood near the front galley, her brow furrowed in concern as she tapped furiously on her tablet. The system was clear. Marcus Jordan, Seat 2A, First Class, Executive Platinum, Corporate Override confirmed. There was no logical reason for his removal, at least none that could be found in the airline's regulations. A cold, sinking feeling settled in the pit of her stomach, the kind of feeling that comes when you know something is not just wrong, but deeply unjust. She stepped back into the jet bridge, pulling out her personal phone. Her voice was low but firm, her words precise. "Hi, this is Tamika from Gate 18. I need you to get a message to the Executive Platinum desk immediately. Michael Jordan's son was just forcibly removed from his confirmed first-class seat." She ended the call without waiting for a response. No drama, no hysterics. Just the quiet, efficient delivery of a truth that she knew would soon ignite a firestorm. Back in the cabin, Catherine Miller moved through the first-class aisle with a practiced, artificial grace, her smile tight and unwavering. She offered pre-departure champagne, her voice a smooth, professional purr, as if the ugly scene that had just unfolded was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a brief and forgettable interruption. "He'll be just fine back there," she remarked to a passenger who had questioned the move. Children are remarkably adaptable. But not everyone was so easily placated. In Seat 2C, Isabelle Dubois sat with her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed in a silent, simmering fury. "That boy had a valid ticket," she muttered to the man seated next to her. "A first-class ticket. I saw it with my own eyes. That was not about policy. That was about something else entirely." Meanwhile, in the rear of the plane, Marcus sat motionless, but his mind was racing. This was not a new experience. It was a painful, recurring echo of past encounters. He remembered a time, just a year earlier, on a flight from Chicago to Los Angeles with his mother. They had been flying to a charity event, both dressed in stylish, comfortable travel attire. His mother had booked them seats in business class, a small luxury she allowed herself on long flights. But when they had boarded, a flight attendant had approached them, a skeptical look on her face. "Are you sure these are your seats?" she had asked, her tone dripping with suspicion. The question, so simple on the surface, was laden with an ugly implication, that they, a black woman and her son, could not possibly belong in this section of the plane. His mother had calmly produced their boarding passes, her smile never wavering, but the woman had insisted on calling a supervisor. It had taken 10 minutes, 3 different scans of their tickets, and a grudging, half-hearted apology before they were allowed to remain in their seats. He remembered the way his mother's smile had faltered after the flight attendants had walked away, the way a shadow had passed over her eyes. Later, in the car, she had turned to him and said, her voice quiet but firm, "Next time, we fly under your father's name." He hadn't understood then, but he was beginning to understand now. He looked down at his new Jordans, still pristine, still perfectly tied. He hadn't cried. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't even allowed himself a single shaky breath. But he was acutely aware of the stares, the whispers, the subtle shifts in the atmosphere around him. He saw the way the man across the aisle had watched him walk to the back of the plane, his expression a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. He saw the way a group of teenagers, a few rows ahead, had snickered amongst themselves. And most of all, he remembered the look in Catherine's eyes, the way her voice had turned to ice, the moment she had seen him in Seat 2A. She hadn't asked for his name. She hadn't bothered to scan his ticket. She had simply looked at him and decided, in an instant, that he did not belong, and no one had stopped her. Until now. His phone buzzed softly in his hand. A single new message. "On my way, don't move." Just 5 words, but they landed with the force of a thunderclap. A wave of relief washed over him, so profound it was almost dizzying. He didn't smile, but for the first time since he had been forced to leave his seat, the tension in his small shoulders began to ease. In the first-class cabin, a well-dressed man in his late 60s, a man named Arthur Vance, looked up from his newspaper. He had been a silent observer of the entire exchange, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had seen all manner of people in first class over his many years of flying, from boisterous celebrities to quiet, unassuming billionaires. But he had never seen a child, so impeccably dressed and composed, be treated with such open disdain. He hadn't said anything, a fact that now filled him with a quiet shame. He had been a bystander, a silent accomplice to an act of casual cruelty. Bias, he thought to himself, isn't always a roar. Sometimes it's a whisper. Sometimes it's the silence of those who know better. A commotion at the front of the plane drew his attention. The jet bridge door, which had been about to close, swung open again. A tall, imposing figure stepped onto the plane. He was dressed in a simple but elegant charcoal gray suit, no tie, just a crisp, white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. An American Airlines executive badge was clipped to his blazer. It was Michael Jordan. He wasn't just a basketball legend, a global icon, a billionaire businessman. In that moment, he was something far more powerful. He was a father, and his son had called. Tamika, who had been waiting anxiously by the galley, was the first to greet him. "Mr. Jordan," she said, her voice low and respectful. "Your son's boarding pass was valid. We scanned it. He was in 2A. I don't know why they moved him." Michael nodded once, his expression unreadable. "You did your job, Tamika." "Thank you." His voice was calm, almost unnervingly so, but there was an undercurrent of steel that was impossible to miss. He walked past the stunned flight attendants and into the first-class cabin. Two airline executives, their faces pale and drawn, scurried behind him, their attempts to placate him falling on deaf ears. "Sir, we're handling the situation," one of them stammered. "You weren't there," Michael said, his voice still quiet, still controlled. "Now you will be." Back in the rear of the plane, Marcus looked up and saw his father's familiar silhouette at the front of the cabin. His posture didn't change, but a quiet sense of vindication settled in his chest. His father was here, not with anger, not with threats, but with a presence that was more powerful than any shouted words. And with his arrival, the story was no longer about a boy and a seat. It was about something much larger. It was about to become a lesson in accountability, a lesson that would be taught in the quiet, pressurized cabin of an airplane, 0 feet above the ground. The engines of American Airlines Flight 1282 remained silent, but a different kind of power was now coursing through the cabin, a palpable energy that had every passenger sitting a little straighter, their attention fixed on the drama unfolding at the front of the plane. Michael Jordan stood in the first-class aisle, a silent, imposing figure whose very presence had altered the atmosphere of the entire aircraft. He wasn't a celebrity demanding special treatment. He was a father demanding justice. Catherine Miller, who had moments before been the picture of smug authority, now stood frozen near the galley, her face a mask of disbelief. The condescending smile had vanished, replaced by a look of dawning horror. "Sir, we weren't aware that Marcus was," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Michael didn't even look at her. His eyes were fixed on his son, who was now walking slowly up the aisle from the back of the plane. The two of them met in the space between first class and business, a silent reunion that spoke volumes. Marcus looked up at his father, his young face a mixture of relief and quiet pride. He hadn't cried, he hadn't complained. He had done exactly as his father had taught him. He had stood his ground with dignity. Michael placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of both comfort and affirmation. "You did what I taught you," he said, his voice low and steady. "Now, let's finish this the right way." He turned his attention to the pilot, Captain Roberts, a seasoned veteran with a calm, authoritative demeanor, who had just emerged from the cockpit, alerted to the situation by a frantic call from the gate. "I'm requesting a hold on departure," Michael said, his voice still quiet but now carrying a new weight, the weight of a man who was not accustomed to being ignored. This flight will not leave the gate until we have addressed the discriminatory actions of your crew. Captain Roberts held up his hands in a placating gesture. Mr. Jordan, I was just made aware of the situation. If you'll give me a moment to get the facts. The facts are simple, Michael interrupted, his voice sharp and clear. Your crew removed a child from a confirmed, paid-for, pre-cleared first-class seat. Not just any child, my child. And not for any valid reason, but because of a prejudiced assumption. You didn't need to know he was my son. Your crew should have treated him with respect regardless of who his father is. Jason Reynolds, the first officer, who had been lurking in the background, now stepped forward, a defensive scowl on his face. Sir, with all due respect, you have no respect. Michael cut him off, his voice like ice. You're the one who said, and I quote, just move the kid. I have it on video. A collective gasp went through the cabin. Jason's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Catherine, desperate to regain control of the situation, stepped forward again. Mr. Jordan, we were simply following airline policy regarding unaccompanied minors. Don't, Michael said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Don't you dare hide behind a policy that you twisted to fit your own bigotry. This wasn't about procedure. This was about prejudice. You saw a black child in first class, and you assumed he didn't belong. That wasn't a policy violation. That was a moral failure, and it was yours. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Then, a voice from seat 2C cut through the tension. He's right, said Isabelle Dubois, standing up so that everyone could see her. I saw the whole thing. That boy was polite, respectful, and he had a valid ticket. She didn't even look at it. She just dismissed him, and we all just sat here and watched it happen. A wave of shame washed over the other first-class passengers. Then, another voice joined the chorus. Arthur Vance, the older gentleman in 1A, slowly got to his feet. I judged him too, he admitted, his voice filled with regret. He looked directly at Marcus. I saw a young boy sitting alone in first class, and I thought, he must be in the wrong seat. I didn't say it, but I thought it, and I was wrong. This isn't just about airline policy. It's about us. It's about the assumptions we make about people before we even know their names. Michael nodded, a flicker of appreciation in his eyes. He turned back to the crew. You have two options, he said, his voice now ringing with an undeniable authority. You can apologize to my son, reinstate him to his rightful seat, and we can all pretend that this ugly incident never happened. Or you can explain to your superiors, to the media, and to the world why American Airlines allows its employees to engage in blatant racial profiling. Jason and Catherine stood there, speechless, their faces a mixture of fear and humiliation. Michael turned to Tamika, who had been watching the scene unfold from the galley. Tamika, he said, his voice softening slightly, would you please escort Marcus back to seat 2A? A small, triumphant smile touched Tamika's lips. It would be my pleasure, Mr. Jordan. Marcus didn't wait for her. He walked back to his seat on his own, his head held high. As he sat down, a smattering of applause broke out in the cabin, a quiet but powerful show of support. Michael turned to the crew one last time. Bias doesn't always shout, he said, his voice low and resonant. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides behind a smile and a uniform. But my son heard it, and so did I. He took a deep breath, then looked directly at Captain Roberts. This plane, he said, his voice ringing with finality, doesn't fly until the wrong people get off it. The cabin of American Airlines Flight 1282 had transformed from a space of quiet luxury into a silent courtroom, and the verdict had just been delivered. The plane remained at the gate, a metal behemoth held captive, not by a mechanical issue, but by a moral one. Outside, the sun beat down on the tarmac, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with a tense, expectant silence. Every passenger, from first class to the last row of economy, was now a witness to a quiet revolution, a moment when a single voice had dared to challenge an injustice and, in doing so, had empowered others to do the same. Michael Jordan stood at the front of the cabin, a silent sentinel, his presence a constant reminder of the gravity of the situation. He was no longer just a basketball legend. He was a father who had drawn a line in the sand, a line that the airline now had to decide whether to cross. Captain Roberts, his face a mask of grim resignation, cleared his throat. "Mr. Jordan," he began, his voice strained, "I understand your position, but perhaps we can resolve this with a formal report filed upon our arrival in Paris." Michael's response was swift and uncompromising. "No," he said, his voice cutting through the captain's attempt at de-escalation. "We will not resolve this later. We will not allow this crew to continue on this flight, to pour champagne and offer warm towels as if nothing happened. You want me to file a report while the very people who discriminated against my son are still in a position of authority over him, over every other passenger on this plane? I don't think so." Jason Reynolds, his face now a pasty white, finally found his voice. "It wasn't personal," he stammered, his words tumbling out in a desperate defensive rush. "We didn't mean any harm." "That's the problem," Michael shot back, his eyes locking onto the first officers. "You made it personal the moment you looked at my son and saw not a child, but a color. And don't you dare try to excuse your actions by claiming you didn't mean any harm. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. This isn't about your intent. It's about your impact. And the impact on my son, on every person of color who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong, is profound." Jason recoiled as if struck. I was just following the lead flight attendant's judgment," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "No," Michael corrected him, his voice like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and cutting. "You were following your own prejudice. She gave you an excuse, and you took it without question, without a second thought. That's not following protocol. That's complicity." The silence that followed was broken by Isabelle Dubois, who was still standing in her seat. "He is right," she declared, her voice ringing with a newfound confidence. "I saw everything. That boy was a perfect gentleman. He was calm, he was respectful, he was prepared. He even offered her his boarding pass to scan again, and she refused to even look at it. Her voice trembled with emotion, but she pushed on. And we all just sat here and let it happen. I didn't speak up loudly enough then, but I am speaking up now." Michael gave her a slight, appreciative nod. "Thank you," he said, then turned his attention back to the crew. "She didn't know who my son was," he said, his voice resonating through the cabin. "And that's the entire point. No child should have to have a famous father to be treated with basic human dignity." At that moment, Arthur Vance, the older gentleman in 1A, stood up again, his voice firm and clear. "I've been flying with this airline for over 30 years, he said, his gaze sweeping over the other first-class passengers. "I've seen it all, but today, I saw something that I will not soon forget. I saw a child's dignity being stripped away in front of a cabin full of silent adults, and I was one of them. That's on me." He looked at Michael, his eyes filled with a quiet shame. "I judged him too, and I was wrong. Thank you for reminding us all of what it means to stand up for what's right." Catherine, her face now a blotchy red, shifted uncomfortably. "Look," she said, her voice defensive. "I didn't mean to insult anyone. I've been a flight attendant for 20 years. I trust my instincts." "Your instincts," Michael said, his voice dangerously low, "are a liability. Your experience should have taught you caution, not carelessness. It should have taught you to see people, not profiles." Captain Roberts, seeing that the situation was spiraling out of his control, finally capitulated. "What do you want us to do, sir?" he asked, his voice heavy with defeat. Michael didn't hesitate. "I want Catherine Miller and Jason Reynolds removed from this flight," he said, his voice clear and unwavering, effective immediately. "They are not fit to serve the public, not on this flight, not on any flight." He then turned to the other passengers. "Is there anyone here who objects to that?" Not a single hand was raised. In fact, a quiet murmur of assent rippled through the cabin. The atmosphere had shifted from one of tense observation to one of quiet solidarity. Tamika Jones, who had been standing by, Now step forward. We have a standby crew at the gate, she said, her voice calm and professional. They can be on board in less than 10 minutes. Captain Roberts let out a long, slow breath, then gave a single, decisive nod. Understood, he said. I'll make the call. Catherine's face crumpled. You're taking me off the flight? She whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. For a misunderstanding? Michael turned to her one last time, his expression unreadable. No, he said, his voice devoid of anger, but filled with a quiet, profound sadness. Not for a misunderstanding. For a misjudgment. A misjudgment that my son will carry with him for the rest of his life. He deserved better. And now, thanks to him, every passenger who flies on this airline will be treated better. As Catherine and Jason gathered their belongings, their faces a mixture of shame and disbelief, and were escorted off the plane by a grim-faced airline supervisor, there was no applause, no jeering, no public celebration. There was only a profound, respectful silence, the kind of silence that falls when a hard-won truth has finally been acknowledged. Marcus sat in his seat, watching them go. He didn't smile. He didn't feel a sense of triumph. He simply whispered to himself, his voice so low that only he could hear it. I'm not angry, but I'll remember. Michael walked over to his son's seat and knelt beside him. Do you want me to stay on board with you? He asked, his voice gentle. Marcus looked up at his father, his eyes shining with a quiet strength. I'll be okay, Dad, he said. You go do what you need to do. A rare, genuine smile touched Michael's lips. You already did what I raised you to do, he said. He then turned to the airline executives, who had witnessed the entire exchange from the jet bridge. This isn't just about my son, he told them, his voice now calm but firm. It's about your entire corporate culture. It's about trust. It's about respect. And it's about whether American Airlines wants to be a company that simply transports people, or a company that actually values them. The executives nodded, their faces a mixture of apprehension and awe. One of them quickly made a note on his phone. Another whispered urgently into his earpiece. Meanwhile, Isabelle Dubois leaned across the aisle and handed Marcus a small folded piece of paper. On it, in elegant, flowing script, she had written, "Thank you for your courage. You have taught us all a valuable lesson today." Behind her, Arthur Vance added quietly, "Dignity is a powerful thing, young man. Don't ever let anyone take it from you." The plane remained at the gate for a few more minutes, but a profound shift had already taken place. It was a shift that would ripple out from this single flight, a shift that had been set in motion by the quiet courage of an 11-year-old boy and the unwavering love of his father. It didn't take long for the new crew to arrive. Within 10 minutes of Captain Roberts' call, a new first officer and lead flight attendant, both with calm, professional demeanors, were on board. They were briefed on the situation, their expressions a mixture of shock and solemn understanding. As the cabin doors were finally closed and the plane began to push back from the gate, a sense of quiet relief settled over the passengers. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when the scales of justice had been balanced, not in a courtroom, but in the close confines of an airplane cabin. Marcus sat in his seat, the quiet hero of an unsought drama. He didn't gloat, he didn't seek attention. When the new flight attendant, a kind-faced woman named Sarah, knelt beside his seat and said, "Marcus, we are so honored to have you on this flight," he simply nodded and said, "Thank you. I'm okay." The other passengers, moved by his quiet dignity, treated him with a gentle, respectful deference. They had seen him not as the son of a celebrity, but as a young man who had faced down prejudice with a courage that many of them could only admire. Michael Jordan had remained on board just long enough to see the new crew settled in. Before he left, he had a final, quiet word with the airline executives. "This isn't the end of this conversation," he had told them, his voice low and firm. "When my son's dignity can be so easily dismissed, it speaks to a systemic problem within your organization, a problem that I intend to help you fix." And then he was gone, his departure as quiet and understated as his arrival. He wasn't a celebrity throwing his weight around. He was a father who had protected his son and, in doing so, had sparked a movement. Back in seat 2A, Marcus accepted a glass of orange juice and a warm chocolate chip cookie from Sarah. It wasn't a bribe or a peace offering. It was a simple, genuine gesture of kindness. Isabelle Dubois leaned across the aisle again. "If I had possessed half of your grace at your age," she said, her voice filled with admiration, "my life would have been very different." Marcus considered her words for a moment, then replied with a wisdom that belied his years. "My dad says that grace isn't about letting things go," he said. "It's about holding on to what's right, even when it's hard." Isabel smiled. "He raised you well," she said. In the row ahead, Arthur Vance, who had been quietly observing the exchange, turned around and crouched down beside Marcus's seat. "May I say something, young man?" he asked gently. Marcus nodded. "Of course, sir." "When I first saw you sit down," Arthur began, his voice filled with a quiet sincerity, "I made a judgment. Not a spoken one, but a silent one, and it was wrong. I want you to know that I see you now, not as a child, not as someone's son, but as a young man who has reminded an old man what true character looks like." "Thank you for telling me that," Marcus replied, his voice soft but clear. "Most people wouldn't." "I'll do better next time," Arthur said, a promise in his eyes. "You have my word." As he returned to his seat, a quiet warmth spread through the cabin, a warmth that had nothing to do with the plane's climate control. It was the warmth of shared humanity, of a lesson learned and a wrong righted. Up in the cockpit, Captain Roberts went through the final pre-flight checklist with his new first officer. His voice was steady, but his eyes held a new, more thoughtful expression. Before giving the final clearance for takeoff, he made one last call to the ground. The American Airlines Director of North American Operations, a man who had been hastily summoned to the gate, had a final request. He had asked to speak with Isabelle Dubois and Arthur Vance upon their arrival in Paris. "We're putting together a new passenger advisory council on diversity and inclusion," he had explained. "Their voices are exactly what we need." But the biggest change was yet to come. By the time Michael Jordan had returned to his private car, he had already dictated an email to the entire board of directors of American Airlines. It was a formal proposal for a new, system-wide initiative, a program designed to address implicit bias and promote a culture of inclusivity at every level of the organization. He had even given it a name, the Marcus Protocol. Marcus, of course, knew nothing of this. He simply looked out the window as the plane finally lifted off the ground, the city of Charlotte shrinking below him. He thought about how strange it was to be so young and yet to have already taught so many adults a lesson in fairness. Sarah, the new flight attendant, came by to check on him one last time. "Is everything all right, Marcus?" she asked, her voice filled with a genuine concern. He nodded. "Yes, thank you." She paused, then added gently, "If there is anything at all that you need, you just let me know." Marcus looked around the quiet, peaceful first-class cabin, then back at her. "I'm not angry," he said, his voice clear and steady, "but I'll remember everything." Sarah's eyes softened. "That," she said, "is why you will be a force for change, not just a footnote in a news cycle." A moment later, the plane leveled off, its wings catching the last rays of the setting sun. And for the first time that day, Marcus closed his eyes, not in fear or frustration, but in a quiet, well-earned peace. 3 weeks later, in a packed press conference at the American Airlines corporate headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas, the world learned just how profound that change would be. The stage was adorned with the airline's familiar red, white, and blue logo, but the atmosphere was anything but business as usual. At the center of the stage stood Michael Jordan, not in a suit and tie, but in a simple, elegant polo shirt and slacks. He stood behind a podium, his presence commanding the attention of the hundreds of reporters, stakeholders, and airline employees who filled the room. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice calm and resonant. "Today, I am proud to announce the launch of a new, company-wide initiative, an initiative designed to ensure that what happened to my son, and to countless others who have suffered in silence, will never happen again." A quiet murmur went through the crowd. Michael paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We are calling it the Marcus Protocol," he continued, "not because he is my son, but because he reminded us all of what dignity looks like under pressure, and what courage sounds like when it speaks truth to power, no matter how quietly." Behind him, a large screen lit up with the words, "The Marcus Protocol, a framework for dignity," at 30 feet. Below the title, a series of bullet points appeared. Mandatory, ongoing, implicit bias, training for all crew and gate agents. The creation of a new, independent passenger review board comprised of community leaders, diversity experts, and former passengers like Isabel Dubois and Arthur Vance. A new, streamlined system for reporting and addressing in-flight incidents of discrimination. And a new boarding procedure, one that would publicly and respectfully acknowledge the presence of unaccompanied minors in premium cabins, not as a potential problem, but as valued guests. No child would ever again be asked, "Are you sure you belong here?" without the entire crew being trained to respond, "Yes, you absolutely do, and we've got your back." Michael then stepped aside, and a smaller figure walked to the podium. It was Marcus, dressed in a smart blazer and slacks, looking every bit the young man who had captured the world's attention. The microphone was adjusted for his height. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd with a calm, unwavering gaze. "My name is Marcus," he began, his voice clear and steady. "And I just want to say one thing. Respect shouldn't depend on who your father is. It shouldn't depend on the color of your skin, or the clothes you wear, or the seat you're sitting in. It should just be." He paused, taking a breath. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," he continued. "I just wanted to be treated fairly. I was scared, but I knew I had to stand up for myself. My dad taught me that when something is wrong, you don't yell, you don't fight. You speak the truth, clearly and calmly." He looked directly into the cameras. "I hope that no other kid ever has to go through what I went through. But if they do, I hope someone will listen." The room was silent for a long moment. Then, a wave of applause, thunderous and sustained, erupted through the hall. It wasn't just for the basketball legend who had used his power for good, or for the airline that was taking a bold step towards change. It was for the 11-year-old boy who had reminded them all that even the smallest voice can speak the biggest truths. The story of the Marcus Protocol became a global phenomenon. Other airlines, inspired by Americans' bold initiative, began to review their own policies, reaching out to Michael's team for guidance and collaboration. The culture of the airline industry, slowly but surely, began to shift. And Catherine Miller and Jason Reynolds, they never worked for another airline again. Their careers were over, not because of a public shaming, but because of a quiet, internal review that had found them both to be unfit for a role that required not just professionalism, but basic human decency. Catherine, in a surprising turn, sent a handwritten letter of apology to Marcus. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she wrote, "but I want you to know that you taught me a lesson that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I can't undo the harm I caused, but I can promise you that I will be a better person because of you." Marcus read the letter, then filed it away in a scrapbook his father had started for him, a scrapbook filled not with painful memories, but with a timeline of transformation. Life, for the most part, returned to normal. Marcus went back to school, played basketball with his friends, and continued to travel the world with his family. But he was different. He carried himself with a new, quiet confidence, the confidence of a young man who had been tested and had not been found wanting. 2 months after the press conference, Marcus and his father boarded another American Airlines flight, this time from Chicago to London. There were no cameras, no reporters, no fanfare. They were just another father and son, heading off on a trip. But as they stepped into the first-class cabin, the flight attendant greeted them with a warm, genuine smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Jordan," she said to Michael, then turned to Marcus. "And welcome, Marcus. We're so happy to have you with us. Seat 2A is ready for you." Marcus smiled back. "Thank you," he said, "but you can just call me Marcus." They settled into their seats, the quiet hum of the engines, a familiar, comforting sound. Michael looked over at his son. "You good?" he asked. Marcus nodded, a look of quiet contentment on his face. "Yeah," he said. "I don't need a big seat, Dad. I just need a fair one." Michael smiled, a look of immense pride in his eyes. "That," he said, "is your legacy." And as the plane soared into the clouds, carrying them across the ocean, it carried with it a new standard, a new hope, a new understanding of what it meant to fly with dignity. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please share it, not just to raise awareness, but to remind the world that one small act of courage can change everything. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never, ever be afraid to speak your truth.